we go. Okay, thank you, Joyce. Okay, so Tzaveh, this week's Torah portion continues where we left off last week, talking about the tabernacle, the Mishkan. It begins by talking about lighting a lamp in the Mishkan regularly. And one of, this is the 7-branch menorah that was in the Mishkan and later on the temple. And one of the lamps was always left burning. So it was always a 24-hour ner tamid, eternal continuous light. And this is the basis for the tradition of having a lamp of some kind over the ark, the ner tamid, in the synagogue. Okay? So then it goes on to talk about Aaron and as the high priest and the various vestments that he is going to wear. It also talks about the special clothing that the other Kohanim were to wear. And that's really what is going to be taking the center stage for the rest of these pages for quite a while. And then some information about how they are to be what's the word I'm looking for? Installed as the priests to consecrate them to serving God in the Mishkan and later the temple in Jerusalem. As pointed out, that this is one of the portions in the Torah that the name of Moses does not appear. It's the only one in the starting with Exodus that the name of Moshe doesn't appear. And so there are a couple explanations given. One is to demonstrate the humility of Moshe Rabbeinu, of Moses, our teacher, that he wanted everything to be centered around his brother Aaron, an introduction to the priesthood. And so he doesn't have his name, or doesn't mention his name throughout the passage. Another points out that according to rabbinic tradition, the 7th day of the month of Adar, which always falls the week that Shabbat we're going to read from Parshat Tzaveh, according to the rabbinic reading of the traditions of the Torah, is both the day Moshe was born and the day he died. Is Yortzeit. And so to suggest that he is missing from this section of the Torah, just like he is missing from our lives. Also, another suggestion is part of it is just like we don't know where Moses is buried. We're told at the end of Deuteronomy, no one knows his burial site. Moses is only mentioned once in passing in the Haggadah as a kind of a sidebar. But he plays no role in the Passover Haggadah. And all of this is meant to make sure that while we understand that Moshe Rabbeinu was indeed a very important element of our life and our people, he is not a god, he's not to be worshipped. He is merely a human being. And therefore, he is also not mentioned in this portion as well. So these are various explanations as to why we don't see Moshe in this week's portion. Okay, I want to continue now with the Hebrew. We're just going to be, it's going to be a little quicker now. Okay, as we move right along, this is on page 49, those of you who have the text. These are what they call some helpful hints and reminders about certain aspects of some of the wording or some of the pronunciation of the words. Now, there are 4 letters, Bet, Kaf, Pei, and Tav, that when there is a dot in them, that changes the sound that way we pronounce them today. There's also the Gimel and Dalet, but we don't make a difference in that pronunciation. But the dot will sometimes appear in other letters in the Torah. And in those cases where that dot, that dagesh is, does not affect the pronunciation of the letters whatsoever. Still going to be pronounced the same it always is. It has to do with grammar, that hopefully someday you'll study a little grammar, and then you will be able to understand what it's all about. Then he talks about what is called in Hebrew a kamatz katan. Sometimes this vowel, instead of the ah, is going to be pronounced more like an o. For example, the word kol, all, that's pronounced as an o. It's hard unless you know the grammar to know when to do that. But for example, the word kol is always going to be pronounced that way, at least properly. Similarly, when it's a chataf kamatz, this form of the vowel, that also is a shortened form and is also going to be pronounced as oh, as an, I say, as an oh to oh. All right. So that's something to keep in mind. Another little bit of a hint, the letter yud, when it follows a vowel, is usually absorbed into the previous sound. All right. So oi, you don't say oh yeah or anything like that. That's oi. And ui, I've never seen anything that says ui. Ui. Maybe that's what we're trying to say. All right. But it becomes absorbed into the ui. All right. Now, you may hear people who pronounce their Hebrew in a very particular form of Ashkenaz's pronunciation, and O's are always oi. You'll hear them always saying oi. So now, all right. Similarly, we have here that the yud is not pronounced after the eh. Elohecha. Elohecha, there's no change in it. When I was talking about the oi, you will hear some people, and like I said, very Eastern European accent, Eloi, Elohecha, Eloi. All right. Then, when the chaf has it at the end of a word, there's a dot in it. It becomes ka. All right. As it says, is in the word vichuneka. The dot serves just like it would if it's in the middle, the letters in the middle of a line. It is pronounced as a hard K sound. And finally, at the end of a word, when there's a dot in, if there's a letter hey at the end of a word, and there's a dot in that hey, the H sound is pronounced. Usually there'll be a vowel sound before it, and you would add the afterwards. Again, that's not something that you will often hear regular daveners in synagogues, what have you. But a good Torah reader, somebody who really knows their Hebrew properly, will pronounce that mapik hey. All right, so we have a few extra, we're going to practice these. These are just a few blessings that are good for us to go over together. So I'm going to ask everybody to unmute. All right. So we can say these blessings. The first one it says is for the study of Torah. Every morning we're supposed to study Torah. Every morning before morning davening, we say the bracha for the study of Torah, or occupation with Torah. So let's recite it together. We say Baruch
Atah
Adonai
Eloheinu
melech
Haolam
asher
Hishanu
b'mitzvotav
B'mitzvotav
v'tzivanu
V'tzivanu
la'asok
La'asot
b'divrei
Divrei
Torah. Okay. Now, we've come across the motzi. Hamotzi is the blessing that we recite when we eat bread. Bread is defined as something made from one of the 5 species of grain: wheat, barley, oats, spelt, or rye, mixed with water and not a whole lot more. All right, that's bread. Once you start adding oil, you start adding eggs, you start adding flavors, now it becomes more like pastry, like cookies or cakes. And the blessing there is a little bit different. It says borei minei mizonot. So let's recite that together. I should have everybody have a cookie while we're doing it, but anyway. But before we eat our pretend cookie, we say Baruch
Baruch
atah
Adonai
Eloheinu melech haolam borei minei mizonot.
is or not.
Okay, so now, like all of them, they all begin with the same formula, right? Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. As they translate, blessed is Adonai, God, ruler of the universe. In this case, borei minei mizonot creates all kinds of foodstuffs. Zonis is sometimes we pronounce, all right? So if you're not eating bread and you're not eating pastry and you're eating an apple or a pear, now the blessing is almost the same, except it ends with pri ha'etz. So let's say the blessing together. We say Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei pri ha'etz, who creates the fruit of the tree. Now, if we're going to eat something that doesn't grow on a tree, it's not made from flour, or at least not the 5 species of flour, but it grows in the soil, a radish, head of lettuce, carrot, what have you. Now the blessings is borei pri ha'adama, for the fruit of the earth. So let's read this one together. We say Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei pri ha'adama. Okay. Now, if you have anything else that didn't fit in any of these categories, okay, you're having a Coca-Cola, you're having orange juice, you're having a glass of water because you're thirsty, you want to drink water. We have a catch-all blessing. Everything was created by his word. Shakol niyeh bidvaro. So let's recite this one now. We say Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shahakol niyeh bidvaro. Okay. Now this is a hierarchy of blessings. Are the most inclusive is this one, the last one. If you are totally unaware what you should say on a piece of an item to eat, your Hershey bar, let's say, Sha'akol niyeh bidvaro covers everything. Ideally, you're supposed to know what is the proper blessing for any food you're going to eat. If you don't know the blessing, you're not supposed to really be eating it. Right? But okay, so if it grows on the ground, right? It's not a fruit of a tree, borei pri adama. Now, fruit of a tree actually does come from the tree, and the tree comes from the ground. So if I made a mistake and said borei pri adama on my apple, okay, I don't have to go back and say the proper blessing because it will cover it after the fact, post facto, b'diavad, as we say in Hebrew. On the other hand, the blessing for fruit of the tree, the proper blessing is borei pri ha'etz. And if, as one of my grandsons wanted to do when we were asking him a question, if I wanted to say this blessing over watermelon, and I said Borei Priya Eitz over watermelon, I haven't fulfilled the obligation whatsoever, because there's nothing about trees and that has anything to do with watermelons. Okay? So I'd have to go back and say the proper blessing over that. Similarly, mizonot, that is not included Borei Priya Eitz. It could be included in Borei Priya Dama if I made a mistake. And then again, for hamotzi, for bread is covered by mizonot if you made a mistake, or by she'akol niyeh bivaro, everything is created by his word. Okay. All right, so we're going to do one more page.
I have a question, Rabbi.
Yes.
What happens when your challahs start getting real fancy and get all kinds of
Okay, that's a good question. I think I'm missing a page that I wanted, but we may end up stopping there. That's a question that is asked, you know, if you have too many ingredients in it, maybe really the proper thing is not to say hamotzi. However, Eastern European tradition was very lenient when it came to Shabbat challah. Because Shabbat challah often has egg in it. It may have honey, especially on top of sugar. It may have raisins. Some people like chocolate chips. I think that's a little pushing the boundaries, but right. But if it can be handled like bread dough, then it would still be considered under most cases bread. If it's no longer capable of being handled like dough, for example, I'm making a pancake. So what's a pancake? It's flour and egg and milk or water, whatever the case may be. The major difference is the quantity of the liquid is so high, you certainly could not make a bread out of a pancake mix, flour, you know, when you mix it all up. That would be a mizonot. That's very clearly the case. If I'm having a meal and I'm not traditionally, if we have to go back and understand, first of all, you go back 1,500 years, maybe even less than that. The major food item for people was bread. Everything else was secondary to the bread that they ate. All right? And the language used by the rabbis is to be kovea suda. Maybe I'll just close this for the moment. What am I really making my meal on top of? Now, what is the real core of my meal? Since bread was the core of the meal in the ancient world, it became the tradition that if I'm eating a meal and I start off with bread and say hamotzi, the only other item I might have to say another blessing for would be if I had wine. I decided to have some wine after I had already said hamotzi. Then I'd make a blessing for the wine because wine has its own special importance. But other than that, everything else I had at the meal would be covered by the blessing over bread, hamotzi. And then when I finish the meal, the grace after meals would be the full grace after meals, the birkat hamazon that we recite after eating bread. And even if I had wine, I wouldn't have to say a separate blessing for the wine by itself. Now, if I'm not having bread, then I'm supposed to say a blessing for each kind of food that I'm consuming. And preferably you would start with mizonot, if you have mizonot there, some kind of item that's made from flour. Wine to have its own blessing. And then whatever the elements were going down the line from fruit of the trees to fruit of the earth to the general blessing for everything. And in those cases, we have special blessings that we say after the meal. Okay? Make sense? Okay. I always love to hear the rattle of the heads when, you know, they go back and forth. Okay. All right, last week we were talking about rabbinic literature, and we had gone through some of the codes. Did I send out the passages that I did with you? I'll have to look. I'll look and see if I have it. I'll have to get it to you. I want to talk about now the last form of rabbinic literature, other than novels and all kinds of treatises and what have you. And that's what we call responsa literature. In Hebrew, teshuvot or she'elot u'teshuvot. You know, people might have a question. They don't know what to do under a certain circumstance by Jewish law. Right? And if they have a local rabbi whom they can call up, and all of you have your sponsoring rabbi, I hope you're in touch with him or her to speak with them. We got a question. And they might be able to answer you right away on the phone, even, right? On the other hand, maybe it's a very complicated question. Maybe the rabbi doesn't feel competent to answer the question. It's a very serious question. And so what was done and is done still today, that certain people would gain a reputation as a scholar, someone you could turn to for religious guidance. And especially when we go back before the modern era, right? The only way you could contact them was through a letter. And you would send a letter to say to Moses Maimonides in Egypt. And you might send a little donation along with it to make sure it gets there and that he has an opportunity to answer you. And if he gets the letter and he reads it and he wants to answer it, he will write a letter back to you. And in that letter back to you, he will give you the answer to your question. Now, this has gone on for certainly since towards the end of the Talmudic period till today. The whole concept of she'elot u'teshuvot, questions and answers. The fancy Latin name for it is responsa. Responsa, singular, responsa, plural, response. That's what the English word comes from. Right? The first prayer book that we know of was actually the result of the community in Spain writing back to the academies, to the Gaonim in, at that time, Baghdad, asking about the proper order of the service. And Rabbi Gaon sent a letter, which essentially was a prayer book. And that became the basis of all the prayer books, the Siddurim, that we use up till today. That was a result of a responsa. Right? Now, generally speaking, some response, some questions, the sender might keep, probably would keep a copy of what he sent to you. They didn't have copy machines, right? So they would write it out, another copy of it, and they might keep it for their records. They might be published. That's what happens today still. Sometimes a rabbi who's got a reputation for answering questions might have them published. And then they become available for everybody to read. Sometimes a response is really directed towards one person in their circumstance, but sometimes it might be directed in a more general sense. And those are really the most important ones, because the questioner and the answerer know that this is not just for one individual, but this is for more general guidance for the Jewish community. I didn't do my proper homework, so I don't have a copy in English easily accessible to me to share with you, but I will share some English ones, and I will translate to you some Hebrew ones to give you an idea. Whoops, forgot. I have to first say share. Okay. All right. This is from Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein was a very important Orthodox rabbi, active in the 30s and 40s and 50 up to, I think he passed away in the 80s, 1980s. And he had a reputation for being able to answer questions that people would bring up. Now, depending upon the person writing the teshuvah, the response, he or she today might cite what is found in law codes, right? And something that might be found in the Talmud, and develop the line of inquiry based upon what is found in the Talmud and what is found in the law codes, and then other responses that he may be aware of, and finally giving his psak din, his decision on what the law is. Now we're going to see here, this is one of Rav Moshe Feinstein's, but he doesn't really follow that pattern. He goes more straight to the issue, and perhaps because the nature of it is very different from what earlier sources might have had. Okay, so also though, usually they're published, if they get published, they are published by being divided in accordance with the sections of the Shulchan Aruch. We talked about the Shulchan Aruch last week. Orach Chaim talks about daily life, prayers of the daily prayers, Sabbath and holidays. Yoreh Deah is a section that talks about kashrut, that deals with conversion. It deals with other issues. Choshen Mishpat is the section that deals with what essentially would be called civil law today. And what do we leave out? Orach Chaim, Yoreh Deah, Choshen Mishpat. Run a blank here. Look, when I look real quickly, I shouldn't forget. Even HaEzer. Even HaEzer, which deals with marriage laws to a large part. Okay, so I'm going to read. He did not write in English as far as I know. And the funny thing is, I found this particular one when I was looking for English translations on the Hebrew Union College website, which is a reform. But anyway, so it starts off by saying that this is She'elat Teshuvot. All right, question and answer comes from Igrot Moshe. He would call it Igros Moshe, the letters of Moshe. Most Responsa collections usually have a fancy name with it that somehow relates to the author. His name is Moshe Feinstein, so his work became known as Igrot or Igros Moshe, the letters of Moshe. Yoreh Deah, the question surrounds that part of the Shulchan Aruch. Chelik Bek, the second section, chapter 126. So then he here puts the question: someone who dealing with children who are born outside the land of Israel. And the people that are involved with this say that this individual child is of Jewish parentage. He's being adopted. They're adopting a child in New York City, for example, or Toronto. And the people, the organization that handles orphans is made up of people who are not Torah observant in the eyes of the Orthodox. And so the question is, if that's the case, do they have to take the child to the mikveh for the purpose of conversion? Right? Part of the conversion ritual you're familiar with is that the person goes to the mikveh. Well, if there's doubt because you're not sure you can rely upon the people who are telling you this information, you have to take the child to the mikveh? That's what the question is. So ba'amru hasarsurim al hayeled shalakhu legadel kevan shel Yehudim. It was said about a childless couple who adopted a child to raise him. That they were told that he was of Jewish parentage, that a Jewish woman had given birth to her to her husband, and they are not Torah observant. What is the law? And he wrote this on the 25th day of the month of Tammuz, 5726. All right. This is 82, so do your math. Okay. And this is from a Rabbi David Halpern, who wrote him this question. Okay. So he says, in the matter in regard to this child who was adopted, and the parents, the adoptive parents, are observant Jews, and they don't have any children of their own to raise, and they call this an adoption, and they were under the presumption that the child was Jewish, because that's what they told them, the people who were dealing with the adoption. It's clear, since when the one who said to them, were not observant Jews, we can't rely on their testimony that he is actually a Jewish child. And we have to presume that certainly, all right, that's one point. Secondly, he says we have to presume that certainly this child comes from a non-Jewish parentage, since most people in the country are not Jews. Even in those states, and as we write here, states that have many Jews in them, and especially like what the subject we're dealing with in California, that there are a large number of Jews who live there, but they're still a minority. And that the only reason these people who were handing the child over to them for adoption, one said he was Jewish because they were trying to get extra money from them for the adoption. Therefore, the head of the yeshiva, this apparently the child was going to be brought to school at yeshiva, and the principal of the yeshiva, had his doubts. And certainly it's proper that the principal of the yeshiva, who doesn't want to accept him to learn in the yeshiva until he is taken to the mikveh. And furthermore, he says, even if when they got the child, he was already circumcised, you still have to draw a drop of blood as a sign of the circumcision in the presence of a Beit Din before they take him to the mikveh, because in this country, and I mean the United States, there's no proof from the fact that he's circumcised that he comes from Jews, because many non-Jews circumcised here in the US. By the way, this is interesting. I want to point out, here you have a presumption based upon current practice in the United States in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, 70s, I'm not sure how long, that non-Jews were circumcising their sons. Today, that might be different, because the number of people who are no longer circumcising their children, I don't know if they are the majority now or not, but if they are, then maybe if you have a child that was circumcised under these conditions, you might go back and assume he is Jewish. All right. And if they came to them before he had circumcised, they shouldn't circumcise him, because and you can rely on that because that they had circumcised him. He doesn't have to have the drop of blood drawn for the sign of circumcision. right? Because if these were observant Jews, you're sure that they would have done this. Even though they didn't think about the Beit Din, but the fact that everybody knew this, the youngster was circumcised in accordance with Jewish practices, that's sufficient for the Brit Milah. But if he's not of Jewish parentage or wasn't circumcised, then you have to do it in the presence of a Beit Din. Even they did not intend to, for the, we'll skip over all of this. Okay, so he's saying if the child was circumcised by the adopted parents, certainly even if they didn't do it in the presence of a Beit Din, they were trying to follow Jewish custom, and therefore that's good enough, and you don't have to do anything else. All right. And he goes on to say part of the reason why he is being lenient is because the very question of having to draw blood is a sign of circumcision from somebody who has been circumcised. That in itself is subject to debate. So therefore, and Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, despite being an Orthodox rabbi of high repute, who is considered to be somewhat on the lenient side of the scale. All right. So anyway, he basically says, even though the people told you that he was of Jewish background, we can't rely on it. If they were Jews and they're not observant Jews, then we can't rely upon their testimony. If they're not Jewish, well, then we can't rely on their testimony either to set the idea that the child is Jewish. Okay? So now, that and you see that that's a relatively modern problem, the issue of adopting a child that you're unsure of the status. But even though Rabbi Feinstein doesn't reference it here, we know the Talmud talks about if you find a child abandoned in a city, if the majority of the population is Jewish, you can assume the child is Jewish. If the majority of the population is not Jewish, then you have to assume the child is not Jewish. So what he's talking about, these presumptions are old presumptions. All right. Now, up until the modern era, almost all responsa were sent to individuals. In today's world, you sometimes have, especially like in the conservative movement, you have committees that deal with some of these questions. You don't have to go to that committee, but the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, which is the Rabbinical Assembly's central halachic authority, has a committee made up of rabbis. And what they usually do is a question would be presented to them. The chairman of the committee would usually assign one or two rabbis to investigate and write a preliminary teshuvah, a preliminary responsa, and then the committee would review it. And if it got enough votes, that would become an accepted position in the Rabbinical Assembly. If it had a unanimous vote, then that becomes a standard. Everybody has to follow it. But you could have 6 votes for one teshuvah and somebody else coming up with teshuvah that's contrary to the first one. And that got 6 votes. So you would have 2 responses coming out of the committee, both of which are regarded as legitimate opinions in the conservative movement. We don't have a lot like that, but we do. Now,
Rabbi?
Yes.
I was reading.
I
I
can't hear
don't
you.
know if this is still. Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
One second.
now, you were turning away for a second. Now I can hear you. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now? So
Yeah.
I was reading about that, and I don't know if these numbers are still accurate, but they were saying like right now the council or the committee or whatever you want to call it is 25 rabbis, and like you were saying, any 6 consensus or consensi or whatever constitutes a sort of ruling on that subject. And
Yeah.
so in theory, out of 25, you could have 4, right? Because 6 times 4 is 24.
All right,
So
I'll give you
4
an-
different views, right?
Yeah, matter of fact, a number of years back, the one of the important issues in the modern era was the question about somebody who was openly gay, homosexual, serving in official capacities in a synagogue, rabbi, cantor, officiant of some kind in the synagogue structure. And of course, and the ultimate question was about being ordained a rabbi. So how does one deal with homosexuality in regards to Jewish law and tradition? Because the Bible, the Torah, condemns it as being abhorrent. So indeed, there were 4 different responses that came out of that. One, which was a very, very right-wing, very narrow position, only had the support of the person who wrote it. And so that was just pushed aside. Then there was another one that essentially said, and I'm cutting to the chase because it was much longer and much more involved, saying that the issue of being gay is irrelevant. It's the question of activity. If indeed, as people assume today, that one's status, I'm sorry, I don't know the proper nomenclature. If you are gay, you have sexual desires for someone of the same sex. I'm sure I'm probably tripping over words here because I know we can get in real trouble if we're not careful. If a man has desires for a man or a woman has desires for a woman, everybody to a certain extent might have that. The question is only whether you act on it. Okay? And since the Torah says that if a man has relations with a man as he would with a woman, that is what is being condemned by the Torah. And the only thing that is parallel between 2 men having sexual relations would be anal intercourse. That would still be forbidden, but other sexual activity would not. So anybody who wanted to be a rabbi had to forego, and that was not that was the second most lenient interpretation. Would have to forego certain sexual activities, and others were allowed. The more restrictive one was not as restrictive as the one that was totally rejected, but they basically said there's nothing we can do about it. Yeah, we have to have sympathy. We have to have allow for, certainly welcome to our synagogues, et cetera, but in positions of authority, religious authority, we could not accept people who are openly practicing homosexuality. And then the most lenient of the 4 was basically, don't worry about it. Just accept it. The Torah, when it talks about these behaviors, it was talking about their day and age. And notice that there's also an occurrence close to issues dealing with idolatry. And it wasn't talking about really a situation of love between 2 people. It was just talking about certain aspects of life in those days that were connected with idolatry or rape of some kind. And therefore, if 2 people love each other, that's fine by us. So you had 4 opinions. One, as I said, was shunted aside. One basically said, no, but let's have some sympathies and see what we can do. One said, okay, but we're going to put certain limitations. Whether or not the people really live up to it, that's a different story. We don't know. Don't check bedrooms. And the third one was, doesn't make any difference. Okay. And so all three are considered to be legitimate positions in the conservative movement.
So the other three had at least 6 people
Yeah.
subscribe to them on the committee.
Each
right?
one of those had at least 6 people.
So I don't know, maybe this is more of like a general personal question than it is, you know, what can we do about it right now talking, but do you find that creates disunity within the movement? I mean, in the sense that you have different synagogues that now
Let me,
follow different rulings and-
oh yes. Let me also, that, by the way, having to have 6 votes was added into the proceedings at some point. I don't remember all the details. I'm kidding. It was a number of years ago. But before then, all you needed to do was have a teshuvah that was written.
So not even a majority.
No, I'm not sure if it was 3 votes or even it needed 3 votes, but maybe no more than 3 siding with you. So 2 siding with you and the author. So they wanted to at least kind of narrow it down somewhat. But you will see some of the teshuvot that we're going to look at least in part. Usually that's not the case. Not that plethora of opinions. But there's always going to be somebody who says A and somebody's going to say B. Okay. When an individual is writing it, then that individual usually has to come to some kind of a decision at the end. All right, and what I have on here is from the website. I don't know that you can get to it. It's from the Rabbinical Assembly. You have to be a member and pay your dues and all that. This is a list of questions that were dealt with by the committee. I just want to go through some of them so you can see the variety of questions. First of all, under the heading of marriage and fertility, choosing our children's genes, preimplantation genetic diagnosis, surrogate motherhood, artificial insemination, in vitro insemination, use of birth surrogates. Another one on use of birth surrogates. Obviously, that means they probably had different opinions. And then a third one, surrogate parenting, choosing parenthood, adoption and single parenthood, mitzvah children, which I don't know what that's about. I have to look and see. Mamzerut, the technical term for special kind of bastard. And then a concurring opinion. Obviously, he didn't like 100% what the first one said, accepting Egyptian Karaites into our communities, status of transsexuals, transgender Jews in halakha, contraception, solemnizing the marriage between a Kohen and a divorcee, etc. By the way, the last number at the end is the year there was, I believe it's it's the year that it was written. Okay. Non-Jewish spouse and children mixed marriage in the synagogue. Mitzvah bring people closer. Keruv. Synagogue honors for the intermarried Jew. Synagogue honors for the intermarried Jew. Dissenting opinion. May the reception following an intermarriage be held in conservative synagogue. Congratulations to mixed marriage families. The role of non-Jewish parent blessings for bar and bat mitzvah, participation of non-Jewish parents or grandparents in home religious ceremonies. And a number of these are just some of what they are. Okay. And I'm going to look at one of them in a few minutes. Okay. Now this is a responsa and Orach Chaim, because it's talking about ritual practice in the synagogue. You can see it says this response, the author was Rabbi Daniel Nevins, S. Nevins. And it says this responsum was adopted by the Community of Jewish Law and Standards on January 15th, 2003, by a vote of 16 in favor, none opposed, and no abstentions. Okay, so this is a case where everybody agreed with it. It's very strange to have something like that. Now, I'm not going to go through all of it because it's several pages. I will send it to you, and you might find it interesting reading. But I just want to touch a little bit. Okay, so the question was asked, can a person who is blind read Torah by memorizing the Parsha or by placing a scanner on top of the Torah text, it would translate the text into Braille. All right, so throughout Jewish history, Jews who are blind have functioned as full members of the Jewish community, in many cases spiritual and educational leaders too. In contrast to many ancient societies who scorn and persecute people with disabilities, Judaism has taught us to see the infinite worth of human life and preserve the safety and dignity of all people. One measure of a person's dignity is the extent in which he or she is included in the ritual expectation of his or her community. All right? There is a substantial halachic literature regarding the obligations of Jews who are blind to observe the mitzvot and their ability to fulfill various ritual requirements on behalf of themselves, their families, and the congregation. In this response, we will review the debate about the general obligation of Jews who are blind to observe the commandments, and then specific literature addressing their receiving an aliyah to the Torah, as well as reading Torah for the congregation. This paper will not address all aspects of ritual practice, but will touch on specific mitzvot, which have been the basis for Jewish case law on the blind. Dr. Avraham Steinberg lists 28 mitzvot. For example, blessing upon seeing a king that would seem to require vision for the blind are nevertheless obligated, as well as 15 mitzvot which a physical disability prevents participation. Our question is into which category the various roles of the Torah service fall. Okay, so he's introducing the question and some of the specific issues that are involved in it. Are blind Jews obligated to keep the mitzvot? The foundation text for our question is a sugya. A sugya means a Talmudic passage in Baba Kama 86b through 87a. The Mishnah states, he who humiliates one who is naked, blind, or asleep is liable. In this text, 3 cases of victims are qualified for indemnification. Yet what if these individuals were not the victims, but rather the perpetrators? The Mishnah states that one who is asleep is not liable for humiliation that he caused. Patur v'yashem shebeyesh patur. One who is asleep and causes embarrassment is free from obligation. Does not, however, indicate whether a blind or naked person is liable for causing humiliation to others. The act of apparel exempt in the Mishnah for Jews who are blind is understood to imply that they are indeed liable for any humiliation which they might cause to others. And the Gemara, all right, so now he's going to analyze the Gemara. I don't want to go through all of it, but I just want to show you that's how he's starting off. We read in the Talmud, Rav Yosef was blind. Rav Yosef initially said, if someone would teach the law like Rabbi Yehuda, who stated the blind are exempt from the mitzvot, I would make a feast for the rabbis in his honor. Why? For I am not commanded, but nevertheless I perform the mitzvot. So let's just, first of all, Rabbi Yosef is saying, I am blind, therefore I'm not obligated to perform the mitzvot, all right, but and nonetheless, I do perform them. So that's very nice. I should get extra reward for doing something I don't have to do. But now that I have heard that said by Rabbi Hanina, namely, greater is he who is commanded and performs the mitzvot than one who is not commanded but still performs the mitzvot. Whoever can teach that law is not like Rabbi Yehuda. I will make a feast to the rabbis in his honor. Why? If I am commanded, then I shall have a great reward. So he says, look, I got a problem here. I'm blind. I do try to observe the mitzvot. And along came Rabbi Yehuda and said, I'm not obligated. Okay, I'll make a party for him because I'm not obligated, but I do it. So yay, I should get extra reward. But then Rabbi Hanina said, wait a minute. He's not talking to him directly. This is a different set of circumstances. But he said, if you're commanded and perform mitzvot, that's greater than somebody who is not commanded and performs the mitzvot. So now that was mean Rabbi Yosef is not as good as everybody else in doing the mitzvah. And he said, if somebody can come along and disprove Rabbi Hanina, I will make a feast for him. Right, but these are the kinds of things that talk about. The blind are exempt from reciting Haggadah, as it is written in the Seder because of this, and is written there regarding the rebellious son, this our son. Just as there to exclude the blind, so too here to exclude the blind. Really? Do not Maramei Mar relate? We asked the rabbis from the school of Rav Yosef. Remember, Rav Yosef is blind. Who recited the Haggadah in the house of Rav Yosef? They said Rav Yosef. Who recited the Haggadah in the house of Rav Sheshet? They said Rav Sheshet. So they were blind, and yet they recited the Haggadah, fulfilled the obligation of everybody else who was there, who were not blind. Right, so he's going to go through the various discussions about in this whole area, and you can see it's really a very long. That's why I'm not going to do it. The obligation, and now, so we have to deal with the question of general mitzvot for the blind. Then he goes on to talk about the obligation to read the Torah in public. What are we really doing when we read the Torah? He shows that it's not a law of the Torah itself, but it's a rabbinic ruling. Then we're told we're not allowed to read the Torah from memory. You have to read the Torah text itself. So to cut a long story short, and skipping over most of what really good stuff he has to say, I'll come to his conclusion. Given what we have learned, there are three practical options for a Jew who is blind to participate in Kriyat HaTorah, the chanting the Torah. One, Shomei Oneh. When called up for his aliyah, the Jew is blind, listens to the chanting and ideally follows in the Braille Chumash. After each word or phrase, the reader pauses and allows the blind Oleh softly to repeat the text. This solution has ample precedent, but it would possibly be least satisfying to the Oleh and to the congregation. Oleh Matargem, Mishnah Megillah 4:3 specifically permits a Jew who is blind to serve as a translator. In their day, they would translate the Torah reading into Aramaic that people would understand. So maybe the person called up for the Aliyah could translate the text as you do it from memory. Another option is for the congregation to complete its reading of the Parsha and then to call the Jew who is blind to repeat the Maftir or even longer passage from a Braille text. The Torah blessings would be said while holding on to the Eitzei Chaim of the scroll as a way of giving Kvod LaTorah, honor to the Torah, and to address the concerns of Rabbi Yusuf's side above. But if the blind reader is not also saying the blessings and the Oleh is cited, then he or she follow in the scroll. And so he gives some of these things and suggestions. So conclusion, that a blind person can lead the congregation in prayer. Originally, all prayer was recited by heart, so that's not really an issue. Receive an aliyah and chant the appropriate blessings. When I was a student at the seminary, Professor Shaul Lieberman, who was the rabbi for the minyan at this seminary, permitted a blind person to come up to the Torah and could chant the Haftarah because the Haftarah does not have to be read from a text. So that's a real quick review of that. I want to do one more. And this is maybe a little more germane to all of you. This is an old shul. It was written in 1995 by Rabbi Jerome Epstein. The paper was approved by the Committee on Jewish Law on June 14th, 1995 by a vote of 17 in favor, 2 opposed, and 2 abstaining. And then he gives the names of those who abstained and voted against it and who abstained. Okay? Sometimes when you see the names, if you know the individuals involved, you can already guess the nature of what's going to be going on. All right. So the question is, what role, if any, may a parent or grandparent who is not Jewish assume in the Brit Milah, Simchat Bat, or Pidyon Ben for their children or grandchildren when the ceremony takes place in the home? All right, so he says we've dealt with this in the past. Rabbi Abelson, Roth, and Gordis consider these concerns in a sense of Keruv, bringing people closer to Judaism. And he says that this whole issue, the role of non-Jewish parents in various aspects of Jewish life, has been further considered and at times reevaluated by the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards because of the significant rise in the rate of intermarriage and constant reactions by the Jewish community. History does play a role in teshuvot. You have to be aware of that. Most recent Responsa urged that the synagogue consider both policy issue implications and integrity of ideology, in addition to halakha determining the role of non-Jewish parent in various aspects of synagogue life. Although there are occasions when halakha may permit or may not forbid certain behaviors, it does not necessarily mean that the actions would be appropriate from a policy perspective. It says, really there are two things that we're dealing with. One is simply an evaluation of what the legal background tells us. And the other is the implications of what might come from that policy being adopted. All right. I'm going to let you read it at home because I want to make a conclusion to this here now. But you see, these are the kinds of questions that might be asked. I think I mentioned that famously Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, when heart transplants first came about, he ruled negatively, opposed to them. I'm sure that when the issue of using heart valves from a pig to be transplanted to a person, because they've done that, was dealt with and approved. I remember there was some TV show. I don't remember which doctor show it was, but I knew they were all didn't know what they're talking about. It was a young woman who became very religious, and she needed to have a transplant of a heart of a pig's valve, and she didn't want to do it because it's not kosher. And she's newly Orthodox, and her rabbi comes to her, and her rabbi is a female, which already tells you the writers don't know what the heck they're talking about. No brand new Orthodox woman who's going to have issues like that is going to have a female rabbi. I'm sorry, there may be some today, but certainly not then. And the simple answer was, you're not eating it. End of story. Nowhere does it say we can't make use. So that was Narishkeit. But these questions come up. The other day, in a Talmud class that I was at, I was not teaching it, I was just joining for the Daf Yomi. One of the members of the class, we were talking about certain laws dealing with issues of mourning for parents. And he just finished the year's mourning for his father, I think it was, and talked about how the rabbi told him what he could do and couldn't do. And the rabbi had said something about one thing that he didn't know, and so he did it wrong. So people ask questions like that and all kinds of other issues. All right. Grey's Anatomy, that's what it was. I never watched that very much, but I guess I'll take your word for it. I knew the rabbi, by the way. I was on I was on the Hartman Institute program for rabbis, and she was on one of the people attending that program. So she said she was going to be on the TV show. I just don't remember which one it was. But anyhow, never ever assume anything in a movie or TV show that has anything to do with Judaism is accurate in any manner whatsoever. Okay, never make that assumption. Actually, okay, but these are, there are all kinds of questions in Israel because you have a government run by Jews. You have questions that are sometimes asked about government policy. Now, the government's not bound by rabbinic interpretation, but those come up. Soldiers, Orthodox soldiers might ask questions to the rabbis about certain things, permission to do stuff while they're in the military service, exemptions for Shabbat service, exemptions for kashrut under special circumstances. All of these things come up. All right, I remind you in an email, but we will not meet next week. I'm going out of town and it just won't work for me to do it. So I will either have add a class on the end, or I may record the class that I would cover, and you can watch it at another time on your own. Okay, but that means I have to get myself together to do it, and I'm leaving Sunday morning and won't be back till late Thursday. Okay, so any questions on tonight's interesting or uninteresting and convoluted?
Rabbi Berman,
Yes.
I kind of want to ask a kind of a controversial question
Okay,
to the group.
what else is new in life?
So, because like the topics you had pointed out that triggered the question in my mind, right? Orthodox conversion or whatever, Orthodox rabbis or the Orthodox community may not recognize the Reform or conservative.
I would be
conversion.
strong. I would be stronger.
That's your answer?
Unlikely to recognize.
Okay.
Extremely unlikely.
And what's your take on that?
Look, I'll be honest with you. There are certain conversions that have been performed by my Reformed colleagues that I can't accept. Not because they're Reformed. This is the difference. Where the Orthodox are saying the rabbis are no good. So therefore the conversion is no good. Number one. Two, they say that people don't accept the things they have to accept. Now, when you go before the Beit Din, especially if I'm sitting on that Beit Din, I'm going to ask you whether or not you accept binding upon yourself all the laws of the Torah, and you will do your best to observe them. If you answer no to that question, I can't accept you. If you have problems and you try to deal with them, you consult with your rabbi and work with it, all right. Will you be driving to shul on Shabbos? Possibly. I wouldn't drive to shul, but I understand the realities of the world we have. And so I would not prevent the conversion from that. But if a male doesn't have hatafat dam brit, if a man or a woman doesn't go to the mikveh, if there's not a Beit Din, a reliable Beit Din that observes the Sabbath, that observes the conversion, I couldn't accept it either. But it's on the details of what takes place, what transpires, but not on the details of who the judges are. That's where I differ from them. But I understand where they're coming from. They don't want to give any credit to anything that doesn't follow. And you know what? Even in the Orthodox world, they're being getting crazy, not necessarily recognizing conversions done by well-accepted Orthodox rabbis. Okay? And what happens is as you move more and more extreme in one direction, everybody else becomes treif. And it creates issues. But what can I tell you? That's the reality. I will say this, the official policy of the state of Israel, if anybody's interested in that, is if you are converted by a recognized Jewish community, Reform, conservative, Orthodox, any, and you want to move to Israel, the government officially accept you as being Jewish for whatever benefits that one has under law of return, etc. The Israeli rabbinate will not, but the government of Israel will. Okay, that's a divide there.
Actually,
yeah.
On that same topic, so I know, so that means though still, like obviously if you make aliyah under conservative auspice of a conservative conversion, you wouldn't be able to get married like in Israel and
correct.
other things that are controlled by
That
the
may
rabbinate.
change, that stuff may change, God willing, at some point. But yeah, that's the reality. You would not be able to get married in Israel.
And
you know,
other similar.
There are other ways of doing it.
similar
If you are
stuff,
married
yeah.
outside the state of Israel, the state will recognize you as being married.
Now, I was just curious though. I forget the minister's name. The Minister of Religious Affairs under Prime Minister Naftali's
Yeah,
cabinet, I guess. He's pushing this thing through the Knesset now to create. It wouldn't accept. I don't think conservative or reform, but it's to create, I guess, more like Dati Lumi, like the religious Zionist.
well, what it is if I recall correctly, what they were talking about was expanding the sources for
removing the
rabbis.
monopoly, right?
Yeah, well, right now, the chief rabbinate, I believe, appoints all dayanim who are going to deal with conversion. And you have to go through the chief rabbinate. What his bill would do would say the local rabbinate, which may be more liberal or less liberal, can have their own courts and deal with conversion.
But it would still be only Orthodox, right?
It would
Like
still
from
only
modern
be-
Orthodox all the way through,
Maybe,
right?
maybe. It's possible that some modern Orthodox would slip in. Sometimes they do.
Right.
One of the things that was here in the States was that if certain rabbis who were respected by the chief rabbin in Israel approved these Orthodox rabbis, then their conversions were accepted. But unfortunately, one of those has recently passed away, so I don't know what's happening. And the Orthodox rabbis in the United States don't want to challenge the rabbinate in Israel. It's all politics. It's all power. It's all, unfortunately, the sad side of human nature. Okay. All right. So we will meet again in 2 weeks, and that will be we were talking about Jewish ethics. So we're pushing it back a week, and we'll see about making up the class some way. Okay. Have a good one, everybody. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.